So it's now my great pleasure to introduce our speaker this evening. He's going to be somebody that's already a familiar face to the vast majority of you. Keiron Derek Brown first became interested in invertebrates during a field-based entomology module at university, and he went on to volunteer on soil biodiversity research projects at the Natural History Museum in London. Keiron now manages the FSC BioLinks project with the aim of inspiring amateur naturalists to take up the identification and recording of invertebrate groups that are often forgotten and rarely recorded. In his spare time, which I'm surprised he has so often, but in his spare time, he's an active member and trustee of the London Natural History Society. And he's also, really importantly, the National Recorder for Earthworms. So he runs the National Earthworm Recording Scheme on behalf of the ESB. So I'm going to hand you over now to him for what's going to be a really fascinating talk. I think your screen is already showing, so... Yeah,
oh, bear with me. Now I'm having problems with my charging cable. Technology is great when it works, isn't it?
All right, okay, so that's fine. Just sort yourself out, Keiron. But yeah, we can see your screen, so... And we can hear you all okay.
Yeah, that's fine. Right, thank you for the introduction, Maria. So the talk today is going to be about gardening for earthworms, which means that we're going to go into the ecology of earthworms and look at how that might impact how we can better our gardens for earthworms. So I'm going to start with a little introduction to earthworms, then we're going to go into the ecology, and then we're going to have a little bit of a test for you all as well. I'm aware that it's getting to the part of the day where people get quite tired, so I've got plenty of polls in the talk to make sure that people stay awake and yeah, keep you active. Right. Okay.
Just before we get started, Keiron, you are quite yellow. It's fine. We can kind of work with that. But you're welcome to carry on. But if you want to adjust that, that's fine. But
yeah, I think my video's gone off. I'm not going to play with it because I'm going to end up breaking the code.
No, that's fine. Okay, we'll carry on. That's fine. Okay. No problem. But everything else is fine.
That's fine. Right. Okay. So I thought we'd start with a little lesson in annelid taxonomy. So when I was writing an earthworm course earlier this year, I was really surprised to find that the taxonomists couldn't, it's something that's actually quite hard to define because everything's still moving around quite a lot. The experts can't decide where everything should go. So the diagram that I've put together here is a simplified version, and I had help from two earthworm experts, Rudiger Schmetz from Germany and Emma Sherlock from the Natural History Museum London. But just take everything here with a pinch of salt because the taxonomists constantly move them around. So the annelids are the segmented worms. So they're any worms that are made up of lots of rings. So I just thought I'd show you where in the phylum of Annelida the earthworms fit. So the Annelida divides up into two main classes. There might be more, but this is a simplified version. We've got the Clitellata, which refers to having a clitellum, which is the fleshy saddle type thing that you'll see on an earthworm. We also have the Polychaeta, the polychaete worms or the bristle worms. And this includes things like lugworms, ragworms, and the amazing bobbit worm that hides under the sediment on the seabed floor and comes up and it's a predator of things that live in the sea, like fish. So then if we look in the Clitellata, that divides up into the Oligochaeta, which includes the earthworms, and we'll come to that later. But the sister group to that is the Hirudinea, which is the leeches. So leeches superficially look very similar to earthworms. They can also have that saddle-like appearance when they're an adult. And they have a sucker on each end. So the difference between leeches and their earthworm cousins is what they eat, really. Leeches are predatory, whereas earthworms are not. So where it gets really confusing is when we go into the Oligochaeta. That breaks up into lots of different groups, and this is where there's a lot of dispute within the taxonomic circles. Now, I'm not personally a taxonomist, so don't ask me any further questions about this, but within this group, you've got a number of different groups, which include the enchytrades or potworms. So these are the little white worms that you'll find in the soil and in your compost bin. They look like tiny little, people often tiny little earthworms. People often confuse them for baby earthworms. Then you've also got a number of families that are aquatic worms. So most groups within the oligochaetes are actually aquatic. You've also then got a group called the Monogastrida, which are a group of earthworms that you don't get in the UK. You've got another aquatic group there, and then you've got the Crassclitolata, which includes over 20 families and includes the 3 families of earthworm found in the British Isles. So that's very brief overview of the taxonomy, but I actually find it more helpful when thinking about what an earthworm is to look at the etymology. So what does a word tell us? So earth can mean any of 4 things. And the thing that we're looking at when we talk about earthworms is definition 2 there, and that's the substance of the land surface, the soil. So earthworms are found within the soil, they're worms within the earth. The word worm can be used to describe a number of different things, but we're looking at definition 1 there, which is any number of creeping or burrowing invertebrate animals with long, slender, soft bodies and no limbs. We're not talking about weak or despicable people in this example. If we actually look at the dictionary definition of earthworm as a word in itself, the definition that I found was a burrowing annelid worm that lives in the soil, important in aerating and draining the soil and in burying organic matter. So one of the reasons why I went through annelid beforehand was so that this word isn't foreign to you all when I bring it up here. So I think what's important here as well is that an earthworm, the term earthworm, isn't necessarily a strict taxonomic grouping. It's a collection of families. Some may actually be in different groups. So some earthworms may be more closely related to other annelid or oligochaete worms than their earthworm cousins, though that is all debated as well. So when we're talking about earthworms, it's this collection of larger burrowing oligochaetes that live in the soil alongside the potworms as well. Right, okay, here's the first poll for you. I'll quickly launch this. So this earthworm on your screen, is this an adult? True. This is an adult, true or false? So I'll just give you 30 seconds or so to answer this. Okay, a couple more seconds. Right, let's see what people have said. Okay, so let's share the results. We've got 69% of you said true, it's an adult, and 31% of you have said false. Well, the majority are right, this is an adult. And if you remember, earthworms belong to the group Clitolata because they've got a clitellum, which I don't know if you can see my mouse, my cursor, but it's this saddle, this fleshy glandular area on the earthworm there. So that we refer to as a saddle more commonly, and that tells us that this is an adult. So before earthworms mature, they don't have that visible glandular area that's swollen. And in British earthworms, the saddle is always relatively, it's always within the first third of the body. So that also tells me, oh, I've lost my, that also tells me that this end here is the head, because if we look at the body plan of an earthworm, it's always closest to the head end, unless you've chopped the earthworm somewhere, and then it could be, that could be misleading. So when we're looking at earthworms from the outside, there's very little features that we can see with a hand lens or the naked eye. The main things are that it's got a head. Sometimes it's got a visible male paw. We've got the saddle with a feature called the tubercular pubititis on it. And all the way along the earthworm, it's got these bristles, these seta. But I'm not going to go into that in too much detail. If you want to know more about earthworm features and identifying earthworms, we've got an Earthworm ID with Microscopes course that I'll mention at the end, that we're running with the Field Studies Council Earthworm Society of Britain and Royal Parks. That's actually on Monday, so if anybody's interested, you can book on that. Right, another question. So is this earthworm a male or a female? So let me get my second one. Launch it. Okay. So you can tick one or more answers here. No, you can't. You can tick only one answer. Yeah. So is it male, female, neither, or both? And I'll just give you another 20 seconds or so. Okay, we're getting a clear leader here. Looks like people have been brushing up on their annelid biology. Right. Okay. Everybody's answered. Wow, you guys are amazing. I've never seen that happen before. So here we can see that 68% of you have went for both. And that's right. So earthworms are what we call simultaneous hermaphrodites, which means that when they mate, they both play the part of a male and a female. So both will exchange sperm and both will use that sperm to fertilize their eggs. So I'm going to talk you quickly through the life cycle of an earthworm so we've got an understanding of them. So earthworms will start life as a cocoon. So cocoons you may find in the soil when you're digging. They're these little almost lemon-shaped yellow to brown coloured things. Thank you to Anchors on this call for the photo on the left. That's an earthworm cocoon she found while undertaking our Discovering Earthworms online course and submitted to us. The earthworm cocoons on the right are all from one species, so they can be quite variable. The ones on the right are from a species, the lobworm, which is our biggest species, which you'll commonly get in gardens. Its cocoons are quite visible in the soil because they look like little seeds, but when you pick them up and squeeze them gently, you can tell that there's liquid inside rather than them being a hard seed. So earthworms start life as a cocoon, and in that there'll be an egg that is with an earthworm developing inside. The earthworms will then hatch into small hatchlings. They'll look like almost like the adult worm without the clitellum. They'll grow and they gain their pigment as they grow. And then when they're adults, they'll mate. There's a couple of examples of different types of earthworm mating here, but what they'll essentially do is they'll adopt a 69 position and they'll attach themselves to each other and release slime to create what we call a slime tube. And that sticks them together and that allows them to pass their sperm to one another, which they'll store and then use to fertilize their egg at a later date. And they do this, you'll see on here, on the diagram here, that the saddle produces a mucus sheath that then slides off the end of the worm, off the head of the worm, and that's what forms a cocoon. Now, while it's sliding down moving down the earthworm, it will collect the eggs from the earthworm that's doing this, and then the sperm from another earthworm that's been stored in one of the features on the earthworm. There's a really interesting video from Isabella Rossellini where she's dressed as an earthworm and explains this, if anybody wants to go into a bit of a YouTube hole. Right, so that's the earthworm life cycle. What I just want to point out as well is internally in an earthworm, there are a number of features, but what I just want to focus on today for the ecology is the digestive system. And I'm not going to go through this in any detail, but what I want you to know is that earthworms are basically one huge digestive system from head to toe, or head to tail, I should say. So that's what they're built for. They're built for eating things, digesting it, processing, and they eat a number of different things, which we'll come to shortly. So another quick question. True or false? Earthworms will drown in the soil, will drown in waterlogged soils due to flooding. So you might want to think back to what I said about historically the group of annelids. Where are a lot of earthworms relatives found? Yeah, that's just completely changed the way people were voting. All right. Okay, I'm going to end that now. 2 seconds to vote. Okay, so share the results. So 80% of you went with false. True was actually looking a lot higher until I said what I said. So it is false. Flooding, a lot of earthworms are actually very specialized in dealing with waterlogged soils. So you get species that are quite, well, they're described as quite rare, but it just might be to do with the fact that waterlogged soils aren't as well studied. But yeah, we have some species that particularly specialize in waterlogged soils. So when it floods, the water itself won't kill the earthworms. However, if that water becomes stagnant and all the oxygen is taken out of that water, then the earthworms can actually suffocate. So they can drown in waterlogged soils if it's stagnant, but no, sorry, they can die, but they can't drown. They would suffocate rather than drown. And even if that happens, the next generation of earthworms is waiting it out in the cocoon phase. So they actually normally recover very well from flooding anyway. Another feature that I thought, if we're talking about gardening for earthworms, I thought I should mention earthworm regeneration. Question we get asked a lot is, will an earthworm recover if it's chopped in half? The answer to this is quite complex because different species have very different abilities to regenerate, but earthworms can regenerate lost segments, some much better than others. The way they regenerate their tail if they lose it is it normally grows back quite thin, but with the exact number of segments that was lost, and that tail will be quite thin and pale, and it will gradually get its colour and its pigment back over time as the earthworm recovers. If you chop an earthworm in half, it's highly unlikely to survive if you chop it between the head and the saddle, and that's because that's where most of the important internal organs are. If you chop it between the saddle and the tail, there's a much better chance of the front end surviving. However, in theory, both ends could survive because earthworms can regenerate even their head, some species, but it's highly unlikely in outside of lab conditions that would happen. Some earthworms will even lose their tail as part of a process called autotomy, which is the casting off of a part of the body by an animal under threat. So if an earthworm is very stressed, it will sometimes, its tail will just detach and wriggle, and that's a predator defense. So if you see that happening when you're digging in your garden, just to let you know, that's what might be causing it. Okay, and another thing you might see in your garden, I thought with the promo image that we use, I couldn't not explain this. You might sometimes find earthworms knotted up like this and wonder, what are they doing? Have they got stuck? Have they got tangled? This is what earthworms do when the environmental conditions are not great for them. So in summer, they'll do this when it's too dry, and we call that aestivation. And in winter, they do it when it's getting too cold, there's ground frosts. And we call that hibernation. And what they'll do is they'll quite often dig down quite deep. They'll cover themselves, they'll empty all their guts. They'll cover themselves knot themselves in a ball and cover themselves in mucus and slow down their metabolism so that they can wait out periods where the environmental conditions are not ideal. Okay, right. Another quick question. How many species of earthworms do we have in the British Isles? So we've got a few options there. Is there just one? Is there 7, 15, 31, 56, 108, 219? All right, okay. If you don't know, don't worry, have a guess. It's always interesting to see what people think. Right, okay, I'm going to end that poll there. Share the results. So 33% have went for 31. 10 people think 219. That would make my job as National Recorder a lot more difficult. So it's not 219. A couple of people just thought 1. Well, actually, the 44 that voted for 31 are correct. We do have 31 species in the British Isles. That is kind of debated, and I just did some work with Oxford University, and one of the species that I got that's disputed, people say it's 2, but some people say it's 1, some of the taxonomists say it's 1. Mine came back as the species that it wasn't supposed to be. So that kind of adds fuel to the argument that they may actually just be a single species. So we'll wait and see how that turns out. But yeah, 31 is what we've got in the British Isles, and that's a relatively low number of species compared to our neighbouring countries. So France, for example, has over 100. So the fact that we're an island that was separated by an ice age in relatively recent terms means that our fauna is pretty small earthworm wise. It's lucky for me, that means that we can identify British earthworms by looking at them under a microscope and looking at their external features. Earthworm recorders or scientists in other parts of the world normally have to actually dissect the earthworms and look at their internal organs to identify a lot of species. So yeah, we're quite lucky in the UK compared to the rest of the world in terms of difficulty of ID. So, right, we know a bit more about earthworms now. So what does that mean for our gardens and for natural environments? Well, Darwin got it. He realized that earthworms were really important. And a famous quote from Darwin's book, The Formation of Vegetable Mold Through the Action of Worms in 1881 is, "Worms have played a more important part in the history of the world than most persons would at first suppose." So Darwin actually studied earthworms for most of his adult life. The book that he wrote was his last book that he wrote before he passed away, and it was his best-selling book within his lifetime. So forget Origin of Species, Darwin's best-selling book within his lifetime was this. And it wasn't without its controversy. It's well worth a read, and what it tells us about how the burial process, the natural burial process of things happen, I think is quite amazing. It's yeah, wonderful read, and you can get it really cheap online because it's out of copyright. So there's loads of different publishers that have published the book. So Darwin was really the father of earthworm ecology. He studied earthworms a lot. We don't have time to go into all of that today, but there is a fantastic talk from my fellow earthwormer, Kerry Calloway, on YouTube about Darwin's work on earthworms, and I'll happily recommend that. Earthworms divide up into different groups. So we know we've got 31 species in the UK. We can divide them into 3 or 4 ecological groups. So 3 of those are true ecological groupings, and one's kind of a fourth one that we've split out just because it helps us better describe the earthworms that we've got in the UK. But it's a little bit of a superficial grouping. So I'm going to go into those in detail, and then I'm going to talk about things that you could do in your garden for each of these different types. So the running theme when gardening for earthworms is going to be think like an earthworm. What would an earthworm want? And because we've got these 3 different ecological categories of earthworms, we need to think about those separately. You can't necessarily garden for birds, all types of bird in one way. Some things are going to better support some species of bird, while different actions will support different species. So these 4 groups we're going to call Anecic, Endogeic, Epigeic, and Compost, and I'm going to go into them in detail. Although you can't identify earthworms to species level in the field or live from characters, what you can do is group them into these broad ecological categories in the field. So we'll go through that as well. So we're going to start with the Anecic earthworms. I'm going to start at the bottom of the soil profile and work my way up. So the Anecic earthworms are the deep burrowing earthworms, and these will live in deep vertical burrows that quite often have a kink in to keep them from drying out. And they'll surface at night to feed on leaf litter and other things on the surface. I've seen a video of one of them nibbling the end of live grass actually on a lawn, which I've been told before that earthworms only eat decaying material, but I have seen a video of an earthworm nibbling on the end of a blade of grass. So yeah, they surface at night to feed on leaf litter, etc. They will also mate at night as well. When they do that, they'll keep their tail anchored in their burrow, which means they're able to flatten their tail, which keeps them anchored so they can shoot back in if there's any danger. When looking at identifying these different groups of earthworms, I use the analogy of a suntan. Basically, the more exposure that the earthworm has to the external environment outside of the soil, the deeper the colours. So although these earthworms, you won't see them coming out in daylight, because obviously they would dry up very quickly, they do come out at night, and they'll keep their tail anchored. So their tail, if we use the suntan analogy, their tail is quite pale and they're darker at the head end. They also tend to be a bit darker on top and a little paler underneath. So these are the big earthworms that we have. So they're really large in size. Biggest is 35 to 40 centimeters. Measuring earthworms is difficult because one earthworm, when it's fully contracted, is a very different size to when it's fully extended. So yeah, measuring them live is really, really difficult as well. But yeah, so these are the big boys. And they'll be found in different parts of the soil profile and at different times of year. So we can see from this study of 3 species of Anecic earthworm in monthly soil samples, January to December 1953. Down the side, you've got the depth in centimeters, and then across the top, you've got the months. So the top graph covers 2 species and the bottom graph covers 1. And we can see that they vary a lot, and you'll find them high up in the soil, but also even going quite deep down in the soil as well. One species, Lumbricus terrestris, will create what we call middens. So if you ever see these in your garden, these piles of stones or piles of earth with twigs or leaves sticking out, like here and here, then these are earthworm middens. And if you actually pull them off the ground, you'll see an earthworm burrow underneath. And, oh, yeah, sorry, I meant to, and here's 2 together. So these 2 neighboring earthworms will most likely mate at night because they're within mating distance of each other there when they're out and extended. So that's a sign of the lobworm, Lumbricus terrestris. Unfortunately, we can't use this field sign as a definitive character of that species because sometimes we have found other species living within them. There's no evidence that we have that they've created them, but yeah, further studies to be done. Another sign of these Anecic earthworms that you'll find are earthworm casts on the surface. So species that don't do the middens, you'll quite often find these piles of earthworm casts. And earthworm casts are earthworm poos. Essentially, this is the nutrient-rich output of an Anecic earthworm. So like we said, they live very deep in the nutrient-poor soil. They'll ingest that soil, and then that will be mixed in their guts with the leaf litter. So they're actually ploughing the earth, they're churning the earth. And if you've got these earthworms, you don't need to plough your garden because they're already doing it for you. So just to summarize that, Anecic earthworms are deep burrowing earthworms. They live in deep vertical burrows, surface at night to feed and mate, feed on soil and leaves. And what does that mean with gardening for Anecic earthworms? So they feed on leaves. If you don't have a tree in your garden, you don't have bushes in your garden, you're not going to have leaves, which they need. So if you want to garden for Anecic earthworms, you need bushes or trees potentially that will provide the food that they need. You still do get Anecic earthworms in I've found them in lawns and amenity grasslands. So what I would say is if you are cutting your grass and you want to keep a neat lawn, fair dues, some people would like to, then consider maybe leaving some of your grass clippings on the lawn, and that will provide some food for the Anecic earthworms. And then finally, deadwood's great for Anecic earthworms as well, or anything in your garden that they can rest under. So although they do build these middens and they'll cast on the surface, if they can come to the surface where there's shelter, that they do seem to quite like that, and you will find them resting underneath things. So it gives them safety from predators. Okay, so going up through the soil profile, we've also got the Endogeic earthworms. These are shallow burrowing earthworms that live in horizontal burrows in the upper soil layers. So Whereas the Anecic earthworms will have a permanent burrow that they inhabit, a permanent burrow system. The Endogeics will reuse their burrows, but they'll also be creating new burrows all the time. So they have what we call a semi-permanent burrow system. Now, these rarely come to the surface, though they do tend to come to the surface after rain. And we think they do that because they can move more freely on the surface when it's wet. So it allows them to disperse, but you'll rarely find them on the surface. They're mainly found within the soil, and they feed on soil. So they feed almost exclusively on soil. They will inadvertently ingest things that are also within the soil, sometimes by accident, like tiny little nematodes, etc. But their primary diet is soil. Now, in contrast to the Anecic earthworms, these will often be really pale in colour. And that's because they lack any pigment. So you will find them all sorts of different colours, but that's not created because of pigmentation. So you'll find them bluey grey colours, green, brown, pink, all sorts of yellow, all sorts of pale colours like that. So if you find an earthworm in your garden when you're digging or looking under things, and it looks like it's quite sickly, that's an endogeic earthworm. Now, the size of these earthworms is really variable. They can be medium, and actually some are quite small, to relatively large in size and almost competing with the Anecic earthworms. So the key with identifying these as an ecological category is really that lack of pigmentation and that lack of a deep red, pink, purpley colour, deep purpley, reddy brown colour. Again, these will be found at different, we call them shallow burrowing, but you will find them at in different parts of the soil profile. They tend to be within the first 8 centimeters of soil, but one of the bigger species, Octalasian cyaneum, that will be found as deep down as 15 centimeters, and they'll move down into the soil profile when environmental conditions are not great to hibernate or estivate as well. So a recap on these: they live in horizontal burrows in the upper layers of the soils, rarely come to the surface, and they feed on soil. So if we're gardening for endogeic earthworms, one thing you can do is not dig. You're less likely to disturb them, you're less likely to chop them in half. Although, having said that, they have been found to really like post-ploughed fields, so you will get a lot of them in the loose soils. But if you're not digging in your garden, you're not going to disturb or damage them. Likewise, they live in the soil. If you're putting chemicals on your soil, that's going to end up in these earthworms. And although it may not kill these earthworms, they will act as a reservoir for chemicals. So pesticides, fertilizers, they can end up in the earthworms, and the things that eat those earthworms can then end up being damaged by the chemicals that the earthworms are acting as a reservoir for. And one other thing I'd recommend for endogeic earthworms is, I mentioned earlier about some species being really specializing in waterlogged soils. They tend to be endogeic species. There's one really common species, Icinella tetrahedra. It's really small, this tiny little earthworm. Wherever you've got wet soils, you'll find that. I don't know how it finds it or how it gets there, but wherever you've got wet soils, you'll find it. So creating a bog area or having a soil-based platform into a pond or something like that will increase your chances of being able to support these water-loving, water specialist endogeic earthworms. Right, so on to the next one, epigeic earthworms, and these are the surface-dwelling earthworms. Now, you do get them in the top layer of the soil, but you'll also get them. You'll get them free living in leaf-litter, dung, and deadwood. So these species, their colour is fairly similar. Oh, sorry, they feed on decaying plant materials such as leaf litter, rotten logs, and dung as well. So their colour is very similar to the Anecic earthworms. They tend to be a deep red, dark in colour. They tend not to be as pale at the tail end, but you can see on this one here, it does get paler towards the tail. So they're living on the surface. So if we use that suntan analogy again, they're above ground, so we would expect them to be darker. The difference between these and the Anecic earthworms is that they're small in size. So the smallest epigeic earthworm that we have an adult is only 1.5 centimeters. So if we contrast that to the Anecic earthworms that can be 35 centimeters and possibly over, then there's a big size difference there. Unfortunately, there is a bit of overlap in the middle, but if you've got something that's under 10 centimeters and this color, it's likely to be an epigeic earthworm. So yeah, so you'll get them free living in deadwood as well as in the leaf litter. And yeah, recap, just the same as again. So some of them will actually even live up in trees, so in rot holes in trees and things like that. So they'll climb trees and they'll actually be arboreal. Now the species that we've got, which is Bimastus icenii, which you'll sometimes find in rot holes in trees. You do also find it on the ground, so it's not exclusively arboreal. But whenever I've looked in rot holes, it's the same species again that I'm finding, which is quite interesting. So how do we garden for epigeic earthworms? They live in the leaf litter, so leaf litter is obviously really important. If you don't have leaf litter, you've got no substrate for them to live in, and you've got no food for them. So again, you do get them in lawns. Leaving the grass clippings on your lawn will allow them to come up, and it gives them that area above ground to live in. Deadwood is fantastic for epigeic earthworms. It gives them somewhere to live and something to eat. And you won't just find them in one place. With deadwood, you'll find them under bark. You might find them inside really rotten deadwood, and you'll find them resting underneath it as well. So that is a fantastic feature to have in your garden for epigeic earthworms and many other invertebrates as well. Not everybody has the luxury of a big garden to put bogs and deadwood piles, etc. Particularly in London, some of us have very small patio areas. So what I recommend there that you can do is make sure that you've got something that epigeic earthworms can live under. When I was surveying my parents' garden in Cumbria, the first couple of times I just looked in the soil. Third time, my mum had this area that was covered in plant pots. It was an old shed that my dad had knocked down, and he hadn't sorted out the concrete foundation floor part. So she thought it looked ugly, so she covered it in plant pots. And when I looked under those plant pots, I doubled the number of species that I found. There was a number of different epigeic earthworms that were resting under the plant pots. Particularly if it's an area where you're watering your plants as well, you'll often find earthworms underneath there. Again, trees for leaves, but also we talked about that arboreal species. If you've got a tree with rot holes, you might get that arboreal species in there as well. And I think one final thing that I'll add is having different vegetation structure levels within your garden is good for epigeic earthworms, as well as other species, other types of earthworm as well. We do have some species that are particularly associated with hedgerows and things like that. So having that kind of microhabitat in your garden will enable epigeic earthworms to thrive there. Okay, final group is the compost earthworms. And these are really a subset of the epigeics. They do look a little bit different, and they inhabit a slightly different microhabitat. So we will separate them out. These are high organic matter habitat specialists. So they really like compost, dung, and deadwood. But we're talking about really rotten deadwood here. You usually find them above ground, rarely in the soil. These are much more rarely in the soil than other epigeic species. I've only ever really found them in the soil under cowpats and things like that. They'll feed on rotting plant material and dung, so animal waste. So these are nature's waste recyclers. Now, they're above ground, so we would expect this deep red colour. What differentiates these from other earthworm species is that they're often this red and yellow stripy colour, although not always. And when people see this red and yellow stripy colour, they often think that they've got the most common compost species, which is Icenia fetida, otherwise known as the brandling worm or the tiger worm. However, another species, Dendrobina veneta, looks exactly the same, and they're actually really difficult to distinguish, sometimes even under the microscope. So, yeah, we still have to categorize them as this group rather than an actual species. And these are usually a medium to large size. So anybody who's looked in a compost bin will have an idea of the size of these earthworms because it's normally teeming with them. We did a little survey, and this is still live on the Earthworm Society of Britain's website. It's under Projects Earthworm Compost Survey, and Anchor, I think, might be able to find a link and put that in the chat. And interestingly, so you've got these microhabitat specialists that you don't find in the soil between these microhabitats, but they seem to be able to colonize all of their own accord. So 89% of the people that reported what was in their compost bin told us that they hadn't put the earthworms in, they'd turned up themselves, which was really, really interesting, I thought. So these microhabitat specialists will just turn up. So yeah, like they say, if you build it, they will come. And that's very true of composting. So summary, high organic matter habitats, usually above ground, feed on rotting plant material. So how can you garden for composting earthworms? Well, there's the obvious, have a compost bin. If you've got a compost bin, even if you don't put composting earthworms there, if you've got the right environment, they will find it. Even if it's a sealed bin, they manage to find their way in, which never ceases to amaze me. Also deadwood, like I said, they will feed on really rotten deadwood. So if you've got a deadwood pile that's got deadwood at various stages of decay, once it gets really rotten, you might find composting earthworms colonizing there. Right, okay, I think that's enough of me talking. I've got time for a quick test. So what I wanted to do is, I'm going to go through this quite quickly because we haven't got a lot of time, and I do want to leave some time for questions. Here is an earthworm. That is on moss, so it's quite zoomed in. So this is a relatively small earthworm. So I want you to tell me what type of earthworm this is. So I'm only going to give you 15 seconds to decide. So go quick. I can't see, it's anonymous, so I can't see who's answered what. I can just see how many people have answered. Yeah. Okay, just a couple more seconds. So get your answer in quick. Okay. All right, time's up. Yeah, so 76% went epigeic. This is an epigeic earthworm. It's really small. It's deep red in color. That tells us that it's Anecic. It's not Anecic, it's an epigeic earthworm. Right, okay, so next one. How do I relaunch this? Relaunch. Right, what about this one? So this is quite a large earthworm. It's on a log there. It's probably 20 centimeters or more in length. You can have a look at the color. It was found while hunting for a very rare wet soil specialist that we didn't find in Goring-on-Thames. Right, that's enough time for that one. So 69% of you have went for Anecic. A few of you have went for stripy. So 16% recomposting. It is actually an Anecic earthworm. It is Lumbricus terrestris, a lobworm, the one that builds the middens. The stripes on this are just the glare from the light, so I understand that it can be a bit tricky. If it's got the stripes, it's really distinctive. You'll see it. Right, okay. So let's go on to the next one. So this is another fairly decent sized earthworm. We're probably looking about 15 centimeters. What do we think this is? Oh, wow, answers are flying in. I'm just going to give you 5 more seconds. Yeah, all right, let's see. So 71% of you, so most of you have gone for Endogeic, the soil dwelling, shallow burrowing. Yeah, the fact that it's got no pigment, it's this really pale pink color at one end and bluey gray towards the tail end, tells us that it's an Endogeic. Size, we don't go by size with the Endogeics, it's the color. Yeah, okay, right. And finally, although there's a bit of a clue in what we've had so far, we've got this one. So what I'd be looking at here is the color. So far, you're 100% in agreement here. Oh, no, a couple of people have, oh, yeah, we've got a few people went off piste here. Right, I'm going to close that now. Yeah, so 93% of you have gone with composting. We can clearly see the red and yellow stripes here. I might be wrong, but I think this is not the branding worm as well. So this is that one that looks very similar. Okay. Right. Okay. So I'm going to not do that part because that was for another talk. So I'm going to end the talk just saying a little bit about the Earthworm Society of Britain. So Anchor is going to drop a link in the chat because we've got a couple more events that might be of interest to people. First of all, we've got our AGM coming up in a couple of weeks, and that includes a virtual talk from Dr. Kevin Butt, who is a powerhouse in the field of earthworm ecology. He's studied earthworms for 35 years, and a lot of what I know has come from research that he's done. So he's based at the University of Central Lancashire, and he'll be giving us a talk on his research over the past 35 years. The AGM is open to non-members as well, as is the talk. It's all free to attend. You just book through Eventbrite and you'll find the event on that link there that Anchor will be dropping in the chat as well. I highly recommend it. If you don't want to come to our AGM, you can join the meeting at 12 o'clock and just come for the talk as well. That's fine. But our AGM does include reports on recording and research and stuff. We try and make it interesting, try and make it as little business related as possible. I've also got some earthworm ID courses. So unfortunately, we do have to kill earthworms and preserve them and look at them down a microscope in order to ID them. So I've got 2 courses coming up on Monday and Tuesday at Bushy Park in London. They're both the same course. We're running it twice because we're following that up with 3 earthworm volunteer ID days where we're going to be identifying samples that we collected from the Royal Parks as part of some research we're doing the Mission Vertebrate project. They're only £10 to attend, and I'll give you a free copy of the key, the book, which I think retails at £8.50, £7.50, £8.50, something like that. So it's an absolute steal. And yeah, you don't need to go to either them, one or the other, only a tenner, and you'll get a free copy of the book. The details for them are on the Earthworm Society of Britain's website as well, and that'll direct you to the FSC's website where you can book them. The bookings for these will be closing very soon, so if you do fancy that, try and book by tomorrow. And I think I'm going to end it there, so we've got a little bit of time for questions. I will try and turn my video on and see how yellow I am. Yeah, I'm back.
Oh, you look fine. Thank you ever so much, Keiron. That was really fascinating, full of lots of intriguing detail, lots of good suggestions about how you can help different groups of earthworms in your garden. And even if you just got a tiny garden or just a patio, there's still ways that you can garden in a way that's going to be helpful for them. And it's great that we've got all that information just in time for National Earthworm Day, which is next week, which will all be celebrated. There's loads of questions coming through in the chat. So we'll give it a go and see how many we can get through. I suspect we won't get through them all, but Anchor, are we okay to just pick a few out?
Yeah, I'm going to I'm going to start out. There's some composting questions, Keiron. So I'm just going to start with those. I just have to find them.
I should probably point out that composting is not my area of expertise, but I'll do my best. But before we go through the question, on the Earthworm Society of Britain's website, there is a blog called Super Composters, which is from World Earthworm Day last year. I had the theme of super composters, and we had 3 great talks from 3 very different speakers about composting, and the videos and everything and the Q&As from that are all on the website. So while you're asking the question, Anchor, I'm going to listen, but I'm going to quickly get that link because it's got way more information than I can ever give.
Okay, well, they're actually just questions about what may or may not kill the earthworms in the compost bin.
Okay.
So Carol Neal kind of asked, she said, I know that compost worms don't like citrus, but is there anything else we shouldn't add? And Katja was worried that banana peels might kill them as well. So do you have any insight on that?
So I think with citrus, I don't think it necessarily kills them, but I think if you put too much in, I think it just gets a bit acidic for them. There are certain species of earthworm. So if we think outside of compost bins, there are certain species of earthworm that seem to prefer acidic conditions, but some definitely don't. So it varies by species. I read a book called The Earth Moved by Amy Stewart, who's an American composter, and she talks about what she's put in and what she hasn't. And I think she reports in it that citrus peelings will get eaten. They just might be the last thing. Somebody's mentioned in the chat about onions. That's another thing that they seem to go for last. I can't talk about personal experience because, like I said, it's really not my area of expertise. But the one thing that I'll tell you not to put in your compost bin, and I'm probably preaching to the converted in this talk, but it's slug pellets. So one thing that was really interesting from the compost survey was most composting systems seem to have earthworms in. Very few didn't. But of the 7 people that put slug pellets in, 4 of them didn't have earthworms. So the percentage really shot up. Now I don't know if people were putting slug pellets in their bin on purpose or if they were putting them in the garden and then clearing stuff and they were ending up in there by accident. But it just shows that pesticides, we should be considering what side effects they might have with regards to other things. But I think with the composting system and what you can and can't put in, I recommend trial and error, and it depends how efficient and how active your system is as well. A really quick system will be able to deal with things that a slow system that isn't as well managed will be able to deal with. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, composting is really not my area of expertise.
Well, we've got more composting questions just for you. Putting you on the hot seat, but actually you talked about slug pellets, so we're going to talk a little bit about slugs, if that's okay. So Jules Acton was asking, do they have any enemies in the compost heap? For example, I have lots of slugs, leopard slugs, I think, in mine. So are these...
There are slugs and snails. Oh, I've gone yellow. Here we go. There are slugs and snails that will eat earthworms. What I'd say is don't worry about that. When earthworms are in a compost bin, they will absolutely thrive. And it may surprise people to hear me saying this, but earthworms are an important part of the food chain, which means that they do get eaten, and they get eaten by everything, by loads of stuff. So we can't stop that happening, and I don't think we want to. They're an important part of the food chain. So just like slugs and snails are an important part of ecosystems as well. So I love slugs, and I was on a course just last week with a lady, Imogen Cavadino, about them. I've gone yellow and I can't fix it now.
Don't worry, Keiron, it's fine.
Yeah. So yeah, I wouldn't worry about them, but there are things in the compost bin that will eat them. But then I'd be surprised if there'll be anything in there that will devastate the population.
Right.
I'm still here. I'm just fixing the camera. Okay.
I seem to be having technical issues here as well. Right. Okay. Before my computer decides to completely die on me. Val Hopfinger was asking, how long does an earthworm live for?
Oh, that's one of those how long is a piece of string questions. Like I said, we've got 31 different species. They all are very different. We have these 4 very different ecological groups. And our biggest one is 35 centimeters. Our smallest is just 1.5 centimeters. So some earthworms, I think, will very much have a seasonal life cycle. And the bigger earthworms will hibernate through the more difficult times. When we talk about the number of offspring that earthworm produce within a given period, for some species it will be very different. So some will live fast, die young, some will take their time and put more energy and effort and resource into producing a single cocoon. So yeah, it's difficult to answer. The biggest earthworm in the world lives for quite a number of years. I know that much. So yeah, very, very variable.
So thank you so much for that, Keiron. We've probably just got time for one last very quick question, and then we'll need to wrap up. So I don't think there's one last one for you to pick out, Anka.
Well, You spoke earlier about pesticides affecting earthworms or how they affected earthworms. And Laura Billing actually came up with an interesting question about natural fertilizers. So do natural fertilizers such as seaweed or comfrey juice harm our worms?
No, because they'll eat that, probably, I would have thought. Yeah, what we just don't want are chemicals building up within within earthworms, because they're a bioaccumulator. When they do that, it will build up within the earthworms, and when birds eat them, you'll literally end up with birds dropping out the sky. That's what happened with DDT decades ago. So yeah, the thing with some things like seaweed is they can act as a bioaccumulator as well. So it depends where your seaweed's from. If it's from a healthy ecosystem, then it's probably fine. Earthworms can be used to deal with a wide range of things. They can actually be used in composting systems to deal with biomedical waste, for example, and they can get rid of some quite nasty chemicals and pathogens by breaking them down. So it's not necessarily about harming the earthworms, it's potentially what harm will happen from the earthworms acting as a bioaccumulator.
Thank you again for that, Keiron. We're going to have to call a halt to it now because we are on 7:30. I'm guessing
before we do, Maria, I've got one thing.
Okay,
I saw
no,
one
you carry on,
question.
you carry on.
I saw one question about courses, and they said, "Are you going to do anything in the West Country?" I do have courses, ID courses planned next year for Worcestershire, probably Shropshire, Liverpool, and Herefordshire. But for everybody else, we've got our Discovering Earthworms course, which will be taught by myself and that lady I mentioned, Kerry, that did the Darwin talk, and that'll be taking place in November next year. So it's an online course, and Anchor would highly recommend it. So yeah, so there's that as well. To find out about what courses and things we've got coming up, what I recommend people do is, let me just quickly share a link. There's a newsletter for the recording scheme here. It's free. I don't send out emails very often, just when I've got stuff to say. So you can sign up to that here. I'll drop a link in the chat. I recommend signing up there. And now I'll let you finish, Maria.
That's fine. So what we'll do is we'll send it with we've obviously recorded the session. It will go onto our YouTube channel. You'll get an email to let you know when it's ready. And what I'll do is I'll put in those links. So if you can send those through to me, Keiron, I'll put those links into the email too. So if people haven't managed to get them off the chat, then we'll make sure that everybody kind of knows about how to access all that information, because it sounds fantastic. There's lots of good training available, and even people who are kind of going to do some learning remotely. So there's no excuse for not learning more about earthworms than you currently know. So that's fantastic. Thanks very much, Keiron. Just to let you know, our next talk is on the 28th of October. That will be the last in our regular series, and it will be Lizzie Crotty. She's going to be talking about managing landscapes for wildlife, lessons from Australia, and all about initiatives to halt the tide there of wildlife extinction. So